For years, the United States Navy believed its communications were secure. Encrypted messages moved silently beneath the oceans. Orders passed between fleets scattered across the globe. Submarines slipped through deep waters, invisible and unheard. Secrecy was the foundation of naval power, and yet somewhere deep inside the Pentagon, something felt wrong. Again and again, American naval exercises were anticipated. Fleet movements were countered before they were completed. Submarines reported near-miss encounters that should have been impossible. At first, commanders blamed technology, then satellites, then coincidence. But coincidence does not repeat itself for 18 years. Inside classified briefings, a disturbing question began to surface. How does the enemy already know? Not fragments, not guesses, exact routes, exact timings, exact positions. The Soviet Union wasn't intercepting American communications, they were reading them in real time. The implication was chilling. If Soviet commanders could read US Navy messages, they could track nuclear submarines. They could predict NATO responses. They could neutralize American naval superiority before a war even began. This wasn't just espionage, it was strategic collapse, and yet there was no sign of forced entry, no hacked systems, no intercepted signals. The encryption itself was intact, which meant the breach was human. Someone inside the system had access to the most sensitive cryptographic material in the US military and was handing it over voluntarily, not once, not occasionally, but over and over again, for nearly 2 decades, unseen, unchallenged, unstopped. While American sailors carried out their duties believing they were protected by secrecy, an invisible observer watched from the other side, a traitor with full clearance, a man trusted with America's deepest naval secrets. He was not a shadowy figure passing envelopes in foreign embassies. He did not fit the image of a spy. He wore the uniform. He passed background checks. He attended briefings. He went home to his family at night. And for years, no one suspected him. His name was John Anthony Walker Jr. What he gave away would force the United States to rebuild its entire naval encryption system from the ground up. What he enabled nearly erased America's advantage beneath the sea. And the most terrifying part, this betrayal did not begin with ideology, or coercion, or blackmail. It began with something far simpler. Opportunity. To understand how one man could compromise the entire United States Navy, you first have to understand who he was. Because John Anthony Walker Jr. did not look like a spy. He was not charismatic. He was not brilliant. He was not politically driven. He was ordinary. Born in 1937, Walker grew up without any sign that he would one day betray his country. There were no radical beliefs, no foreign connections, no obvious resentment toward the United States. What he did have was ambition, quiet, persistent ambition, and a desire for stability he never quite achieved. Walker joined the U.S. Navy in the 1950s, a time when military service promised structure, respect, and a steady future. For him, the Navy wasn't about patriotism, it was about opportunity. Over time, Walker proved reliable enough to earn trust, not exceptional, but dependable. And in the military, dependability opens doors. By the early 1960s, Walker had worked his way into one of the Navy's most sensitive areas, cryptographic communications. This was the invisible backbone of naval warfare. Every message sent between ships, every submarine movement, every fleet coordination order. All of it depended on encryption systems designed to be unbreakable. Walker wasn't just handling paperwork, he was handling the keys. At work, he appeared disciplined and compliant. At home, his life was far less controlled. His marriage deteriorated. Money became a constant problem. Debts mounted quietly. Walker wanted more than the Navy could give him. And instead of seeing his access as a responsibility, he began to see it as leverage. What's critical to understand is this: Walker was not recruited, he volunteered. In 1967, while stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, Walker made a decision that would reshape Cold War intelligence. He gathered classified cryptographic materials, documents that explained exactly how U.S. Navy encryption worked. And then he walked into the Soviet embassy. No disguise, no intermediary, no handler, just a Navy man with secrets. Inside that embassy, Walker offered the Soviets something invaluable: the ability to read U.S. Navy communications at will. The KGB did not hesitate. What Walker handed over wasn't theoretical intelligence. It wasn't analysis or rumor. It was operational control. From that moment forward, the Soviets could see how the U.S. Navy thought, moved, and planned. And Walker walked out of the embassy untouched. No one noticed his absence. No alarms were triggered. No investigation followed. He returned to his life as if nothing had happened. That was the moment the Walker spy ring truly began. For the next several years, Walker continued his Navy career, advancing slowly, predictably, and invisibly. He maintained access, he gathered more materials, and he learned something crucial. No one was watching him. The systems designed to protect America relied on trust, and Walker had learned how easy it was to exploit that trust. This wasn't desperation anymore. This was method. Walker realized that as long as he appeared ordinary, as long as he stayed within the system, he could continue indefinitely. And so he did, year after year, handing over updated encryption keys, passing along changes in procedures, ensuring that the Soviets never lost access. Inside the Navy, he was just another sailor doing his job. Outside it, he was quietly rewriting the balance of power beneath the oceans. And the most dangerous part? He hadn't even begun to reach his full potential. By 1967, the Cold War had hardened into routine. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a permanent contest of patience, secrecy, and nerve. Missiles were measured, signals were intercepted, and every move at sea was weighed as a potential act of war. It was inside this tense equilibrium that John Anthony Walker Jr. made his first irreversible move. Walker did not stumble into espionage, he chose it. Stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, Walker had access to cryptographic materials that explained how U.S. Navy messages were encrypted. Daily keys, procedures, and operational instructions that kept fleets hidden from adversaries. To most sailors, these documents were abstract. To Walker, they were currency. On a quiet day in early 1967, Walker gathered a small stack of classified papers, left his duty station, and drove toward the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. There was no recruitment meeting, no coded message, no handler waiting in a dark alley. Walker walked straight to the front door. Inside, he introduced himself and made an offer that stunned Soviet intelligence officers. He wasn't asking for asylum, he wasn't asking for protection, he was asking for money. In exchange, he offered the Soviets something they had never had before: direct access to U.S. Navy encryption systems. This wasn't intelligence gathered secondhand, it was the blueprint. The KGB immediately understood the value. With these materials, Soviet analysts could read U.S. naval communications in near real time. understanding where ships were headed, how submarines maneuvered, and how American commanders thought. Walker handed over the documents calmly. Then he left. No pursuit followed. No surveillance trailed him home. The most dangerous breach in U.S. naval history had just occurred, and no one noticed. From that moment on, Walker became a controlled asset of Soviet intelligence, not controlled in the sense of pressure or coercion, controlled by trust. The KGB paid Walker modestly at first, testing reliability. And Walker delivered again and again. Each visit brought updated encryption keys, new procedural changes, fresh insight into American naval operations. As months passed, Walker refined the process. He learned what the Soviets wanted most. He learned how to package information efficiently. He learned how to avoid detection simply by acting normal. And the most astonishing part? No one at the Navy asked why classified materials kept leaving secure environments. There were no effective inventory controls, no audits that could catch a slow, steady leak. Walker exploited a weakness far more dangerous than any technical flaw: institutional trust. He blended in. He advanced quietly. And as his confidence grew, so did the scale of the damage. By the late 1960s, Soviet naval commanders were no longer reacting to U.S. movements. They were anticipating them. American submarines, once believed undetectable, were being shadowed. Exercises designed to test readiness were failing mysteriously. The balance beneath the oceans had shifted, and the man responsible wasn't hiding. He was reporting to work. Walker had crossed a line that few ever returned from, and now he understood something critical. As long as the Navy believed encryption alone kept them safe, he could continue indefinitely. The first betrayal wasn't an act of desperation. It was the beginning of a system. What John Walker sold was not information. It was control. Inside the U.S. Navy, cryptographic systems were treated as the final line of defense. Ships could be seen. Weapons could be counted. But codes were invisible. They were trusted. Walker had access to those codes, daily encryption keys that determined how every message was protected, how every command was disguised, how every fleet movement remained hidden. When he handed those materials to the Soviets, he wasn't selling secrets about the Navy. He was selling the Navy itself. Each set of keys allowed Soviet intelligence to unlock American naval communications for days or weeks at a time. And when those keys changed, Walker supplied the updates. Again and again and again. There was no dramatic exchange, no frantic spying, just routine. Walker met his handlers, he passed documents, he collected payment, and then he returned to his life as if nothing had happened. From the Soviet perspective, the value was immeasurable. With U.S. Navy encryption compromised, Soviet analysts could follow American submarines across the Atlantic and Pacific. They could track carrier strike groups. They could map patrol routes meant to remain secret for decades. Nuclear deterrence depends on uncertainty. Walker eliminated it. American submarines designed to be undetectable were suddenly predictable. Exercises meant to simulate surprise attacks were anticipated. Defensive maneuvers were countered before they began. The Soviets didn't need to guess. They knew. And inside the Navy, no one understood why. The assumption was simple and devastatingly wrong. The encryption system itself must be secure. So the failures were blamed elsewhere. Equipment, human error, bad luck. Meanwhile, Walker continued supplying the KGB with what they needed most: Updated procedures, new cipher changes, operational manuals explaining not just what the Navy did, but how it thought. This was intelligence at its most dangerous. Not tactical details, but strategic insight. The Soviets could read messages and understand the logic behind them. They learned how American commanders prioritized threats, how they responded to uncertainty, how they escalated or held back. Walker wasn't just opening messages, he was opening minds. And because the system relied on compartmentalization, no single officer ever saw the full picture. Walker operated in a narrow lane of access, but that lane connected directly to everything that mattered. He exploited a truth few wanted to confront. Complex systems don't fail dramatically, they fail quietly. And Walker's betrayal was quiet. It didn't trigger alarms. It didn't cause immediate losses. Instead, it created a slow erosion of advantage. Year after year, Soviet naval planners adjusted their strategies with confidence. American planners reacted in confusion. The longer Walker remained undetected, the deeper the damage sank. By the 1970s, U.S. naval communications were effectively transparent to the Soviets. And still, Walker remained trusted. He wasn't suspected because he didn't fit the profile. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't ideological. He wasn't unstable. He was consistent. And consistency inside a trusted system is camouflage. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, the question was no longer whether the Navy had been compromised. It was how long. And the answer was almost impossible to accept. Nearly 20 years. An entire generation of naval operations had unfolded under the gaze of the enemy. And the man responsible kept showing up to work every day. John Walker's betrayal might have remained a solitary crime, but greed has a way of expanding. By the early 1970s, Walker was no longer satisfied with what he could deliver alone. He had proven his value to the Soviets. The payments continued, the risk remained low, and that realization gave him a dangerous idea. Walker looked inward, toward his own family. His son Michael had followed him into the Navy, young, inexperienced, eager to please. Michael didn't have his father's access, but he had something just as valuable: proximity. He moved through secure spaces without raising suspicion. He handled documents casually. He asked questions that seemed harmless. Walker didn't present espionage as treason. He framed it as opportunity. The world, he suggested, was unfair. The Navy took loyalty for granted, and the Soviets were simply paying for information the US already controlled. To Michael, it didn't sound like betrayal. It sounded like helping his father. Walker eased him into it slowly. A document copied here, a procedure described there. Nothing dramatic, nothing that felt irreversible. That was the danger. Michael became part of the operation before he fully understood what it was. And once he crossed that line, there was no going back. The Walker household became an extension of the espionage pipeline. Documents were stored temporarily. Information was discussed casually. Secrets were normalized. Espionage stopped feeling like espionage. It became routine. But Walker didn't stop with his son. He expanded outward. Jerry Whitworth, a Navy communications specialist and longtime friend, had access that Walker no longer did. Where Walker's reach was narrowing, Whitworth's was expanding. Walker saw the opportunity instantly. He approached Whitworth not as a recruiter but as a peer, someone who understood the system, someone who knew how much trust was misplaced. Whitworth resisted at first, but Walker persisted. He emphasized how easy it was, how invisible it felt, how safe it had been for years. Eventually, Whitworth agreed, and with that decision, the damage multiplied. Whitworth had access to newer, more advanced cryptographic systems designed to replace the very ones Walker had already compromised. The Navy believed it was closing old vulnerabilities. In reality, it was handing fresh keys to the same enemy. Now, the Soviets weren't just reading old communications, they were staying ahead of every update. Inside the Walker network, roles became defined. Walker coordinated, Michael assisted, Whitworth delivered high-level material, and none of them believed they would be caught. Why would they? Years passed. Nothing happened. No investigations, no suspicions. The system appeared blind. But the most fragile part of the operation wasn't technology, it was trust. Family loyalty doesn't operate like espionage discipline. Resentments grow, marriages collapse, people talk. And the longer the ring operated, the more pressure built beneath the surface. By pulling his family into the betrayal, Walker didn't just increase his reach. He planted the seed of his own exposure, and when it finally surfaced, it would not come from an intelligence breakthrough. It would come from the inside. For nearly 2 decades, the Walker spy ring operated in plain sight. Not because American intelligence was careless, but because it was confident. During the Cold War, the U.S. Navy believed its greatest threats were external. Foreign intercepts, satellite surveillance, enemy submarines lurking beyond detection. Internal betrayal was considered rare, unthinkable. The Navy trusted its encryption systems with near-religious certainty. They were mathematically complex, constantly updated and guarded by layers of procedure. If communications were compromised, the assumption was simple: the technology must be at fault. So when Soviet forces appeared to anticipate American naval movements, analysts searched for technical explanations. Faulty equipment, poor signal discipline, coincidence. What they didn't search for was a human source. That was the blind spot. John Walker didn't raise suspicion because he didn't behave like a threat. He didn't live extravagantly, at least not in ways that stood out at first. He didn't voice radical opinions. He didn't challenge authority. He fit the system, and the system rewarded conformity. Background checks were periodic, not continuous. Financial reviews were limited. Behavioral assessments were informal. As long as someone did their job and avoided obvious trouble, trust remained intact. Walker understood this instinctively. He paid his bills just enough to avoid scrutiny. He avoided dramatic changes. He maintained a low profile. Meanwhile, the Navy's cryptographic environment worked against itself. Access was compartmentalized. No single person had full visibility into the entire system. Each role was narrow, specialized, and isolated. That meant no one saw the full pattern. Walker operated in a small slice of the machine, but that slice connected to everything that mattered. And when encryption keys were updated, replaced, or improved, the Navy assumed security had been restored. They didn't consider that the updates themselves were being delivered to the same enemy. The result was devastating. The Soviets stayed synchronized with U.S. naval communications through multiple generations of encryption. Each time the Navy believed it had fixed the problem simply moved forward with them. Internally, doubts surfaced, but they never converged. One analyst noticed odd timing patterns. Another observed repeated intelligence failures. A third raised concerns quietly, without evidence. But without a clear suspect, these warnings dissipated. No one wanted to accuse a colleague without proof. No one wanted to believe the system itself was compromised from within. The cost of being wrong felt higher than the cost of being silent. So silence prevailed. Walker's greatest protection wasn't secrecy, it was institutional psychology. Organizations built on trust resist the idea of betrayal. They explain anomalies before confronting uncomfortable truths. And Walker exploited that reluctance expertly. Years passed. Promotions came. Responsibilities shifted. The damage accumulated quietly. By the time intelligence officials began to suspect a mole, the question wasn't if secrets had been compromised. It was how deeply. And the answer was almost too severe to accept. The blind spot had allowed a single insider to dismantle naval secrecy piece by piece without ever tripping an alarm. But blind spots don't last forever. Eventually, pressure builds. And when it breaks, it doesn't come from technology, it comes from people. By the time John Walker's access began to narrow, the damage should have slowed. It didn't. Because Walker had already found someone who could carry the breach forward. Jerry Whitworth wasn't reckless. He wasn't impulsive. And he wasn't desperate. He was precise. Whitworth was a seasoned Navy communications specialist, quiet, competent, and deeply embedded in the systems that replaced the very encryption Walker had already compromised. Where Walker's role was fading, Whitworth's was expanding. He understood the equipment, he understood the procedures, and most importantly, he understood the implications of what he was being asked to do. At first, Whitworth resisted. He wasn't motivated by ideology, he didn't admire the Soviets, and he didn't see himself as a traitor. What he did see was a system he believed was flawed, and a friend who insisted the risk was minimal. Walker didn't sell espionage as betrayal. He sold it as inevitability. He argued that the Soviets already had advantages, that information always found a way out, that their actions merely leveled a field already tilted. It was a lie, but it was a comforting one. Eventually, Whitworth crossed the line, and when he did, the Walker spy ring entered its most dangerous phase. Whitworth had access to next-generation cryptographic material, codes designed to close the vulnerabilities Walker had opened years earlier. The Navy believed it was restoring secrecy. In reality, it was refreshing the enemy's access. Each update Whitworth delivered allowed Soviet intelligence to stay synchronized with American naval communications without interruption. It wasn't a single leak, it was continuity, a bridge from old systems to new ones. And because Whitworth was careful, meticulous even, he left almost no trace. Documents were removed briefly, copied discreetly, and returned. Procedural manuals were memorized, not stolen. Keys were described, not photographed. The system remained intact. Only the secrecy was gone. For Soviet naval planners, the advantage was extraordinary. They didn't need to break encryption. They didn't need to intercept signals. They simply read the messages. Exercises designed to test American readiness failed before they began. Submarines intended to remain invisible were tracked with unsettling accuracy. And inside the Navy, the confusion deepened. Every fix seemed to fail. Every improvement was neutralized. Unknown to them, the reason was simple. The enemy was never locked out. Whitworth's role ensured that no matter how advanced the encryption became, it arrived already compromised. And unlike Walker, Whitworth was patient. He didn't seek attention. He didn't demand rapid payment. He maintained the rhythm of normalcy. That patience extended the life of the spy ring by years. It also magnified the consequences. By the early 1980s, U.S. naval communications had been exposed across multiple platforms and theaters. An entire generation of operational secrecy had been stripped away, and still Whitworth remained invisible, because intelligence failures are often misattributed, and because trust, once established, has inertia. But the pressure inside the ring was increasing. The more people involved, the more fragile the operation became. And Whitworth understood something Walker had ignored. Espionage isn't undone by brilliance. It's undone by human error. By the late 1970s, the Soviet Union no longer treated American naval communications as intelligence. They treated them as reference material. For Soviet naval commanders, the fog of war had lifted. Messages that once required analysis now required only translation. Orders meant to remain secret were read calmly, line by line. American intentions were no longer inferred. They were confirmed. The access provided by the Walker spy ring gave the Soviets something no surveillance platform could deliver: context. They didn't just know where U.S. ships were going, they knew why. They understood command priorities. They recognized hesitation and urgency. They learned how American naval doctrine responded to uncertainty. This was strategic insight at the highest level. During fleet exercises, Soviet vessels appeared in positions that suggested advanced knowledge. Submarines shadowed American counterparts with unsettling precision. NATO maneuvers were countered before they unfolded. Inside U.S. intelligence circles, the pattern was undeniable, but unexplained. Analysts suspected satellite interception. Some suspected leaks from Allied forces. Others blamed chance. But the idea that encryption itself had been compromised for years remained almost unthinkable. For the Soviets, the advantage reshaped planning. Naval deployments were adjusted with confidence. Risk assessments changed. Strategic calculations became more aggressive. Deterrence depends on uncertainty. The Walker spy ring removed it. American ballistic missile submarines, the backbone of nuclear deterrence, were designed to vanish into the ocean. But when their movements were anticipated, deterrence weakened. The Soviets didn't need to neutralize these submarines. They only needed to know where they were, and they did. Exercises intended to demonstrate readiness instead exposed vulnerability. Operations meant to test secrecy revealed patterns. The United States was unknowingly teaching its adversary how it fought. Inside the Pentagon, something felt profoundly wrong. Naval commanders reported too many coincidences, too many near encounters, too many failed surprises. But without a visible breach, intelligence leadership hesitated. Accusing one's own systems or one's own people carried enormous consequences. So explanations remained external, and the Walker spy ring continued uninterrupted. For nearly 2 decades, American naval power operated under compromised secrecy while believing itself secure. The Soviets didn't need to penetrate defenses, they were invited inside. And this access wasn't used recklessly, it was used patiently. Soviet planners avoided overt exploitation that might expose the breach. They blended knowledge subtly into strategy. They stayed just ahead, never too far. That restraint kept suspicion low. It also extended the lifespan of the spy ring. The most damaging espionage operations aren't loud, they're quiet. They don't cause immediate catastrophe. They reshape reality slowly until the damage is irreversible. By the early 1980s, the Walker spy ring had altered the balance beneath the seas. And still, no one knew who was responsible. But pressure was mounting, and inside the Walker network, strain was beginning to show. Espionage doesn't usually collapse because of intelligence brilliance. It collapses because people break. By the early 1980s, the Walker spy ring had been operating for nearly 2 decades. The access remained intact. The payments continued. But the pressure was changing. What had once felt controlled began to feel unstable. Money, once the motivation, became a source of exposure. Walker's finances grew harder to hide. His spending habits no longer matched his income. Debt cycles repeated, payments arrived, but problems followed. Inside the ring, tension increased. Whitworth became more cautious. Michael grew uneasy, and Walker himself became reckless in ways he hadn't before. The discipline that had protected them began to erode. Walker drank more, he talked more, he trusted less, and the longer the operation ran, the more fragile it became. Espionage demands emotional restraint. Family life does not. Walker's marriage had long since collapsed and resentment lingered. Arguments turned bitter. Threats were made and ignored. What had once been compartmentalized inside Walker's mind spilled outward into personal conflict. And that was something the KGB could never control. Inside U.S. intelligence, small anomalies began to surface. Nothing definitive, nothing actionable, but patterns were hardening. Financial inconsistencies, behavioral shifts, access histories that didn't quite align. Still, no one could see the entire picture, and so the machine continued forward, damaged but uncorrected. The most dangerous phase of long-term espionage isn't the beginning, it's the middle. That's when operatives grow comfortable, when shortcuts replace caution, when routine dulls fear. Walker had survived for years without consequence, and survival breeds confidence. That confidence became his weakness. He began storing materials longer than necessary. He handled payments carelessly. He assumed invisibility. But invisibility fades when pressure mounts. The ring's greatest vulnerability wasn't encryption. It was people. Relationships strained. Trust fractured. Silence became unsustainable. And unbeknownst to Walker, the very family ties he had exploited were becoming unstable. The operation was no longer clean. It was leaking. And while intelligence agencies still hadn't identified the breach, the conditions that protected it were unraveling. Espionage thrives in control. The Walker spy ring was losing it. The collapse wouldn't begin with a breakthrough. It would begin with a phone call. The Walker spy ring did not end because of advanced surveillance. It did not end because of intercepted messages or cracked codes. It ended because of a person the intelligence system never considered a threat. John Walker's ex-wife. By the mid-1980s, Walker's personal life had become as unstable as his secret one. The marriage was over, but the resentment remained. Arguments had grown bitter. Threats were made casually. And Walker's sense of control, once absolute, began to slip. What Walker failed to understand was simple. Espionage depends on silence. Relationships do not. His ex-wife knew things she was never meant to know. Not the details, not the mechanics, but enough to understand that something was deeply wrong. She had seen unexplained money. She had heard careless remarks. She had felt the weight of secrets carried too casually. And as pressure mounted, fear replaced tolerance. In 1985, she made a decision Walker never anticipated. She contacted the FBI. At first, agents were skeptical. Cold War paranoia produced many accusations. Most went nowhere. But this one was different. The details, though incomplete, pointed in a direction too serious to ignore. The FBI opened a quiet investigation. No arrests, no confrontations, only observation. Walker was placed under discreet surveillance. His movements were tracked, his routines documented. And slowly a pattern emerged. Suspicious meetings, unexplained absences, behavior that no longer fit coincidence. The most dangerous espionage cases are not exposed by dramatic evidence. They are exposed by accumulation. And as the evidence grew, the implications became staggering. If the allegations were true, the FBI wasn't dealing with a minor breach. They were dealing with a collapse that spanned decades. Surveillance intensified. Agents followed Walker carefully, avoiding detection. They watched as he handled materials too casually, as he maintained contacts that raised alarms, as his confidence betrayed him. Behind the scenes, intelligence officials prepared for the possibility that the damage was already catastrophic. And when the FBI finally moved, it did so decisively. In May 1985, Walker was arrested. There was no chase, no standoff. Just a quiet end to one of the longest espionage operations in American history. In the days that followed, arrests spread outward. Michael Walker, Jerry Whitworth. The ring collapsed rapidly once exposed. What stunned investigators wasn't the betrayal itself. It was its scale. As evidence was reviewed, intelligence officials realized that U.S. naval communications had been compromised continuously for nearly 20 years. Entire encryption systems were rendered useless. Operational assumptions collapsed. The cost was incalculable, and all of it had ended not through technology, but through a single human decision to speak. The Walker spy ring didn't fall because it was discovered. It fell because silence finally broke. The arrests sent shockwaves through American intelligence. What had begun as a quiet investigation now demanded public reckoning. John Walker's trial exposed a truth few inside the Navy wanted to face. The damage was not hypothetical. It was real. It was documented. And it was devastating. Prosecutors laid out the evidence methodically. Years of classified material handed over to the Soviet Union. Encryption keys updated again and again. Procedures compromised before they could protect anything. Walker did not deny it. He admitted to the espionage openly. In court, there was no ideological defense, no claim of coercion, only money. Walker had sold secrets because it paid, and because no one stopped him. The court sentenced him to life imprisonment. His son, Michael Walker, received a lengthy prison term for his role. Jerry Whitworth, whose access had extended the damage into newer systems, received one of the harshest espionage sentences in American history. The punishment reflected not just betrayal, but consequence. Inside U.S. intelligence agencies, the trials triggered something more painful than outrage. They triggered self-examination. How had this happened? How had it lasted so long? Investigators conducted exhaustive damage assessments. Every system Walker and Whitworth touched was reviewed. Every assumption was questioned. The conclusion was staggering. The Soviets had enjoyed near total access to U.S. Navy communications for almost 20 years. An entire generation of naval operations had unfolded under enemy observation. This wasn't a failure of technology. It was a failure of trust. The Navy was forced to rebuild its cryptographic infrastructure almost entirely from scratch. New systems were introduced. New oversight procedures implemented, Continuous monitoring replaced periodic checks. But reform came at a cost. Confidence was shattered. Inside the intelligence community, suspicion replaced certainty. Colleagues questioned colleagues. Trust was no longer assumed. The Walker spy ring had done more than compromise communications. It had damaged the culture of intelligence itself. For analysts and officers who had lived through the Cold War believing secrecy was intact, the revelation was disorienting. The enemy hadn't broken in, they had been invited, and the realization lingered long after the trials ended. Espionage doesn't just steal secrets, it rewires institutions. The Walker case became a cautionary lesson taught inside intelligence training programs. Not as a story of clever spying, but as a story of overlooked vulnerability. Ordinary people with access, long-term trust without verification, systems built on assumptions instead of evidence. John Walker would spend the rest of his life in prison, but the consequences of his actions would outlast him. They reshaped naval security doctrine. They altered how insider threats were assessed. They changed how trust itself was defined. The reckoning wasn't confined to a courtroom, it spread through the foundations of American intelligence. And the cost would never fully be known. The Walker spy ring did not end with a sentence. It ended with a question. How many secrets were lost that will never be counted? How many decisions were made under the assumption of privacy when none existed? Decades after the arrests, intelligence officials still struggle to measure the full impact. Because espionage damage doesn't announce itself, it echoes. For nearly 20 years, the Soviet Union, and later Russia, listened quietly as American naval communications flowed freely. They didn't need to guess intentions, they didn't need to intercept signals. They already had the keys. Entire fleets moved under compromised secrecy. Exercises unfolded with known outcomes. Strategic assumptions were shaped by information never meant to be shared. And all of it was enabled by one man who believed the system would never look inward. The Walker case reshaped how intelligence agencies define threat, not as a foreign presence, but as an internal risk. Insider threat programs expanded, financial monitoring became routine, access controls tightened, but the most important lesson was simpler and harder to accept. Espionage does not always look dangerous, sometimes it looks ordinary. Walker didn't fit the stereotype of a spy. He wasn't charismatic, he wasn't ideological, he wasn't driven by belief, he was driven by convenience. And that made him invisible. The Walker spy ring forced intelligence agencies to confront an uncomfortable truth. Trust, when unchecked, becomes vulnerability. Today, the case is studied not as an anomaly, but as a warning. Because systems evolve, technology improves, but human behavior remains constant. People still struggle with money, with resentment, with entitlement, and the temptation to exploit access never disappears. John Walker died in prison in 2014. He never expressed remorse. To the end, he maintained that he had only taken advantage of opportunity. But opportunity exists everywhere. What makes espionage possible isn't access alone, it's silence. The silence of systems that assume loyalty. The silence of institutions that resist scrutiny. The silence of people who believe someone else is watching. The Walker spy ring survived because no one thought to ask the right questions early enough. And when they finally did, it was already too late. The Cold War has ended, but the lesson remains. The greatest threats to national security are not always external. Sometimes they sit quietly inside the system, unnoticed, trusted, and unchecked, waiting.